Today, our first big question that we're going to be tackling is, what does it take to decarbonize mobility? So as you may or may not know, Lancaster has been absolutely central in developing really interesting, engaging research on mobilities and mobility's futures in particular. We have the Center for Mobilities Research based in our department. We've had 3 international conferences in 2004, 2013, and 2017 that have addressed different aspects of mobilities and how we actually think about them, not only in relation to possibilities for the future and transformation, but also in relation to global perspectives on mobilities and ways that we can understand the intersection of social sciences, art, activism, different types of creative methods. So we really today are very excited to have 2 speakers to share some of their recent research and thinking with you. First, we'll hear from Dr. Nicola Sperling, who's a lecturer in our department in the theory and methods of social futures. And then after her, Professor Monica Boucher is going to speak. They'll each take about 10 minutes to share some of their research and thoughts. After that, they're going to have a short discussion between themselves, asking a few questions, and then we're going to open up to questions from you. Okay, so I think that's it for me, and I will now pass over to Nicola Sperling, who's going to give us our first presentation for the day. Nicola, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Alison. So hi, everybody. I'm Nicola Sperling. I'm a lecturer in the Sociology Department and I'm based in the Centre for Mobilities Research. And in this short talk today, I want to look at what multimodal travel is, why it's a significant topic, and I want to highlight the ways that it's currently thought about in policy and innovation, and then explore some of the ways in which sociology can contribute to making multimodal futures. Let me start with a definition. Low carbon multimodal mobility refers to trips and lifestyles that are achieved through a combination of different forms of travel and services, such as online shopping, in place of the fossil fueled car. This is a significant topic because to avoid climate change, the UK must reduce carbon emissions to net zero by 2050, and emissions from transport must be cut to 44% by 2030. So we have less than 10 years. The transport sector is now the largest contributor to UK carbon emissions, and yet it's proving the most difficult to change. Urban areas have the highest carbon emissions and need to change first. And integrated multimodal travel, the use of active travel, such as cycling and walking, and mobility services, such as public transport or Uber, for example, to achieve car-free trips and lifestyles, is the front-running strategy, which is supported by the UK Department for Transport. This is a significant policy emphasis, which has been sort of apparent in the strategy for urban transport since 2019. So whereas previously electrification and automation of vehicles was being emphasised as the answer to the carbon challenge, this has been refocused now, and this relates to a whole set of evidence which has emerged over the last couple of years, which shows that embedded carbon, that is the carbon that's involved in actually making vehicles in the first place, that when we take that into account, simply replacing combustion engine cars with electric and automated vehicles just isn't going to cut it. In fact, the future needs to involve many fewer vehicles than today, and in addition to reducing fossil fuel usage. So integrated multimodal mobility seems to be the most feasible way forward. However, providers are working in the dark. They know little of how people achieve multimodal lifestyles, and when the pace of change must be fast, it could be easy to get things wrong. What's more, multimodal is hardly spoken about in the mobilities literature, and there's been very little research on this topic in transport studies, so it really is an area that's ripe for development. This is the UK Department for Transport's urban strategy, which was published in 2019. And it's one of the documents where the idea of multimodal mobility is made very explicit. In this document, we see a very strong idea of how low carbon mobility that's getting rid of fossil fueled cars from cities. The idea is based on an expanded vehicle ecology comprising micro-mobilities, active travel, ride sharing and increased vehicle occupancy. And it's based on the idea that these modes can be integrated and provided as mobility as a service to deliver a replacement for fossil fueled mobility culture. I'd say that within this document, there's actually three visions of multimodal sitting alongside each other. The first of these is a multimodal city, a city that's filled with a much broader vehicle ecology than we currently see. The second is an idea of multimodal trips, so trips that are made up of multiple stages and that are done through different vehicle modes. This is also called the intermodal. And thirdly, there's an idea of multimodal lifestyles. So lifestyles where, yes, sometimes journeys will be done by just one mode, but hopefully there'll be much less fossil fueled car and people will be using different modes for different trips and purposes and completely replacing some trips through services such as online shopping. I'm interested in all of these visions, but today I want to focus on the second of these, the idea of the intermodal. Within the document that I've looked at, but also more generally in discussions of integrated transport systems, there's actually quite a simplistic idea of what it involves to become multimodal. It's an idea that we'll have a journey that's normally done by car from A to B, and that with integrated transport, if providers can integrate modes well enough using smart technology or integrated ticketing, then that A to B journey can be done in a seamless way using other modes. Here's another example. There's an idea that if the technology and pricing is right, then it will happen. And I want to challenge that idea because I think that to do intermodal travel actually involves a great deal of ingenuity, skill and know-how on the part of those doing it. So I want to suggest a different way of conceptualising integrated multimodal travel. Drawing on the work of Elizabeth Shove and colleagues in Lancaster Sociology, forms of mobility can be analysed and conceptualised as skilled practices. To take cycling as an example, an instance of cycling will bring together skills, know-how, materials and cultural meanings. For example, a successful cycling trip would involve being able to pedal and balance and navigate. It would require having a bike in the first place, as well as some other equipment and access to appropriate roads and paths. And it would also need to be a normal and acceptable thing to do. Sociological work on cycling, such as by Cosmin Popan and Simon Cook, expands this view. In particular, they expand on the material elements involved in cycling, showing that cycling takes place in a dynamic material world. This emphasises that when we step outside of the car, many other aspects of the material world become significant. The urban environment changes in weather and seasons or daylight and dark, creating cold air, icy roads, muddy paths and dark streets. And this is part of the skills and know-how of the cyclist who must equip themselves and plan their routes to navigate this dynamic material world. This is complicated further if we consider the end-use practices that travel's for. For example, if we take an example of office work, then this practice in itself has its own skills, materials and cultural meanings associated with it, such as the skills to present oneself appropriately in different work situations, appropriate clothing and laptops and other equipment, and an importance placed on appearing and being professional, meeting certain standards of cleanliness and so on. Some of these elements of office work contrast with elements of cycling practice, and some create challenges for it. And so if these two practices are kind of brought together, if we start to cycle to work, then this kind of this sort of conflict can emerge. And I've highlighted some of these on this slide. For example, the way that you need to keep yourself dry and warm on a bicycle might conflict with how you're expected to present yourself at work, or carrying all of your work stuff in a pannier bag might feel out of place in an important meeting. So whereas the car provides a protective shell from seasons and weather, it carries drivers and passengers and cargo from A to B, and it delivers its passengers to their destinations in the same state in which they left home. Moving without a car requires new everyday logistics, not only to achieve movement, but also to engage in the end uses that travel's for. To switch to a life based on velo mobility rather than automobility is a challenge in itself. So just think then about the complexity of a multimodal trip. Doing multimodal movement requires taking account of weather and seasons, travel time and diurnal patterns, of equipping oneself with clothing or lights and bags, of planning a route that probably changes in the weather and the seasons or the time of day, of dealing with breakdowns and disruptions and the potential to get stranded away from home, of working out how to travel with children and cargo. of sort of figuring out where to interchange, of what must be taken and of what can be left behind, and of still arriving at your destination in a state that's appropriate for whatever end-use practice the journey is for. This kind of fine-grained analysis, which is the business of sociologists, is precisely what's needed to make multimodal futures. The everyday expertise of those already doing low-carbon multimodal movement is a vast and untapped resource of knowledge and skill, and it's from them that we could learn about these aspects in specific places. For example, Transport for Greater Manchester know that car use is declining in the urban core, but they don't know what's taking its place. They have a vision for a low-carbon multimodal city, and yet they know little of how people achieve multimodal lifestyles. Just think of the novel insights and innovations that might result if we did this work on the ground. These might include things like recognising that multimodal travel takes different forms in different seasons and speculating on seasonal multimodal transport strategies for cities. It could lead to new knowledge and proposals on interchange design and location. It could help us develop tools and services for breakdowns and disrupted journeys, or multimodal citizen packs and how-to guides and workshops. It might lead to new travel app design that takes account of real-world issues like travelling with children and cargo or through different weather. Viewing integrated multimodal mobility in this way as a skilled practice could also enable the inherent inequities of these visions to be revealed and critiqued, with the aim of addressing inequity as part of the path to zero carbon. There are other things that I could go on to say about the data that's currently available to local authorities and the data which they actually need to understand emergent multimodal travel. However, I'll leave it here for today and make a few conclusions. So to conclude, in broad terms, I find the recent policy shift on urban mobility promising in terms of the path to zero carbon. I agree that car-free trips and lifestyles is where the effort needs to be placed. However, I'm sceptical of the provider-side approach that's focused on ticketing and smart technology. I think that sociology has a huge amount to offer on this topic, and especially by revealing, exploring and understanding emergent, multimodal, everyday expertise, and by placing this at the heart of design and innovation. And this is where I'll be focusing my work in the coming years. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Monica, I think if you're ready, I will throw over to you.
And so in this presentation, I will argue that to decarbonize mobilities, we need a way to measure the societal readiness of innovations. The idea of societal readiness levels has been around for a while, and I'm developing it together with Nicola and colleagues in the Is It Ethical and Decarbonate projects. And I started it with a focus on digital ethics and socially responsible innovation. And now we find it is critical for decarbonizing transport. In a nutshell, societal readiness levels are a way to gauge how ready innovations are for society. How well do our technology, policy, or social or socio-technical innovations support real-world transformations in social and material practices of mobility, societal values, and new good socio-technical systems. It goes from SRL1, a concept with potential for systemic change, to SRL9, an innovation integrated into normal life and supportive of good life and society and nature systems. Of course, good and better are highly contested notions, and SRL are a way to help the diversity of stakeholders impacted become aware, reason, communicate, decide, and evaluate responses. So why do we need this? We, and I mean humanity, have never tried to bring about a transformation of how we live that is as profound or rapid as that implied by our Paris commitments to address climate change. And before COVID, we had never experienced what that might look like and feel like. And what we need to do in the next decade is a truly enormous societal challenge. This is where we are. Our current policy scenarios are heading towards more than 3 degrees warming. The consequences would be catastrophic and extremely unequal, bringing about what Naomi Klein calls a new barbarism, especially with a view to large-scale human movement and migration. And this is where we need to be. To keep warming below 1.5 degrees, we need to reduce emissions by more than 7% every year this decade. The COVID crisis has given us a head start this year. The seismic shock of our mobility system has delivered a 4.6 reduction. So in the remaining months of 2020, we now need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by another 3% to meet this year's target. And of course, if we don't, the challenge for the coming years will be greater. So what outside of further waves of COVID will allow us to achieve that? You can see the scale of the challenge. Our ways of life, our societies need to change much more than we have in these utterly unprecedented times. Is society ready for it? The evidence suggests yes. 6 million young people protested on the streets for climate action last autumn. Extinction Rebellion has more than 400 affiliate groups. And 64% of Americans understand that climate change is anthropogenic. 70% of British people want political action to tackle climate change. And yet, I don't mean to pick on the UK, it is much the same in other countries. The world is taking a totally inadequate technocratic approach. There are 6 main avenues of innovation that the UK Department for Transport consulted on this year. Our options are modal shift, decarbonizing through technology and place-based innovation, greening economic growth. And here are some examples. Electrification as a way of decarbonizing road vehicles. Automation with robots delivering our goods and autonomous public transport vehicles. What's the problem here? None of this achieves or even aims for systemic change when we know that our mobility systems, not just the individual components, need to change. Electrifying millions of cars and building more roads will achieve the opposite. It will lock us deeper into car culture, aspiring to electric minis and Teslas. Fear of COVID means that the number of people who choose to travel to work by car has almost doubled. 66% of people choose the car in the UK, and they buy a car if they don't have one. Then there are serious equity issues. People on lower and precarious incomes living in high-rise or terraced housing have far less agency over electrification than those more affluent and those living more affluent and secure lives. And this is largely invisible and unaddressed in our policies. And by embedding charging points in city centres and homes and not park and ride car parks, we infrastructurally lock in journey patterns that are unsustainable. So, slightly devil's advocate, I would put many of the solutions we have right now right at the bottom of the societal readiness scale. These innovations are not ready for people to adopt them. They do not lead to good societal outcomes. They are concepts, technical prototypes, seriously lacking social and societal readiness. There are more and more systemic attempts, and the Decarbonate network is developing more. And as we're doing so, we also find many unintended consequences. Societal readiness levels can support formative evaluation of innovation as ideas emerge. The UK government has just advertised for a data expert to set up skunkworks, that is, experimental data analysis laboratories to explore the use of big data for achieving net zero. Just envisage, with the example of the UK, how data on where carbon emissions are the highest could be combined with data on people's voting patterns, constituency boundaries, and population sizes. The place-based solutions that the Department for Transport is looking for may well be intended to identify the greatest polluting areas and then shape measures to encourage progress in decarbonising. But clever data analytics behind the closed doors of a skunkworks, not open to public engagement, could also open doors to counting pollution in politically convenient ways, such as not counting the many flights that those affluent citizens with their electric vehicles are taking. It could help identify the most politically sensitive areas where strong measures may change voting patterns and translate into a political reluctance to implement strong policies. We have worked with technology readiness levels for far too long. They can tell us if a technology is theoretically ready for markets and implementation, but it doesn't allow people to assess how useful, usable, and societally good innovations are, or what their unintended consequences might be. It leads to solutionism. What we need instead is responses that increase our responsibility to the climate emergency, co-created with and for society. A societal readiness framework provides us with a way of measuring the value, ethics, and usefulness of innovation. And it supports us in devising methodologies that make social practices the focus of innovation, make innovation accountable, collaborative, equitable, and support citizens to turn from passive consumers of solutions to technologically and ethically competent data and carbon subjects. It can support more systemic innovation that breaks all old, maybe not all, but old car-dependent infrastructures and patterns for infrastructures for all of us. And we know that mobility is a complex system, that there are many conflicting interests, stakeholders, and responsibilities. Societal readiness levels can support a commoning of mobilities, a collaborative approach, bringing everyday practice, engineering, policy, politics into dialogue. It doesn't have to be lockdown, demand reduction, decarbonisation of business as usual. It can be a truly innovative rethinking of how we can share mobility as a common collective good, not as an individual right or freedom with all the inequalities that brings. So this is not a finished framework. We're working on it and you can help shape it. You can read more about it at the link and we'll put it, we'll make it available and you can contact us to discuss with us. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Monica. I think it's such an intriguing idea, and you've certainly started me thinking in terms of, you know, where society readiness levels might fit, how they might be used, the ways they might be questioned. So I'm sure many of you who are watching also have some questions. Please feel free to put your questions or comments in now, and we will collect those up. Should we go chronologically? And Monica can ask a few questions of Nicola first. Does that make sense?
Makes sense. Yeah, I have a ton of questions for you, Nicola.
Thanks.
The first one, maybe I can ask them in combination. So My question is really, how does multimodal travel innovation constitute systemic change? So in some respects, what you're describing is people are doing the same journeys, just differently, and walking and cycling more as part of it, or using more low carbon measures. But to make systemic change, don't we have to change actually the journeys that we make, the reasons why we make those journeys?
I agree, and actually, so in terms of my work on multimodal, this is something that I've really picked up on, and one of my ambitions is to sort of expand our definition of multimodal. So I would say the most common usage of the term is to refer to intermodal trips. Then in recent years in the transport studies literature, we've seen that expanded through empirical work using the National Travel Survey to look at multimodal lifestyles, so to take account of these, although it might be a unimodal trip, there's more variety and people are kind of creating a life for themselves where they're using less car. But I actually do think we need to then extend that to also include people who achieve car-free lifestyles through then engaging in sort of what I was calling end-use practices in new ways, which could be online shopping, which could be working at home. I mean, it's some of the things that we've almost seen happen during COVID. So it's almost like a reconfiguring of everyday life and therefore the amount of movement that everyday life entails.
Yeah, I was wondering, and this connects also to Roger's question, who asks, you know, people are already skeptical of these pop-up cycle lanes from around COVID, and how can we convince skeptical citizens? I was wondering how, you know, you talk about the skills, the everyday skills, and I think Cosmin would also talk about the everyday pleasures and pains that come out of doing these multimodal journeys, whether they actually will somehow, you know, by experience, by prefigurative practice, make people see the systemic potential of change. So people have actually noticed very much the lowering of air pollution, the bird sound, the more community spirited nature of well, yes, travel in some respects. Yeah.
I mean, I thought the question about bringing skeptical citizens along, it's a really good one, and obviously that's you know, there's no straightforward answer to that. There's just different avenues that can be explored, but to me, I'm very interested in sort of, I suppose, taking account of the fact that they're not just choices that people make, they're actually things that require learning. There is a great deal of skill and know-how that's involved in trying to move around and still achieve everyday life without a car. You know, those of us, you know, that have tried, have experienced that firsthand and experienced some of the things that can go wrong, not only to do with the logistics of it, but to do with perhaps injuring yourself a little bit and things like that as well. So there are lots of complexities about it, but I think acknowledging the fact that these aren't simply choices, that they require a lot of skill and know-how, and that people actually would need to be supported in order to actually try them out and try and live that way, is one way of thinking about it. And then I suppose having this setting in COVID where we've people that perhaps didn't normally move around that way have started to try it out. You would kind of there's no evidence around that, but you would expect that people's kind of experience of it is going to have an influence on what happens next for them.
Yeah, I'm not sure whether to ask my next question or follow on from this. I was wondering about, you know, you talk about the difficulties and the things that can go wrong, but do you also have a sense of the things that go right and that encourage people to do it?
So not yet. This is why I really think that we need empirical work on it. So at the moment, there isn't really that much work that is specifically focused on multimodal lives in this way.
And another question would be, multimodal also includes this. We're traveling,
Yes.
we're traveling like this, and actually we're discovering, like Alison said at the beginning, we're discovering many ways of doing things differently, including having conversations between us that we actually, in the normal run of days, we don't necessarily have time to do, and actually include people in it. So there are these things. But one more question that I had was, you talk about how the policymakers are working in the dark because they don't know anything about this, about the things that go wrong or the things that go right. And you mentioned social science as a source of that knowledge, but I would argue that citizens themselves could be much more a source of that knowledge and input there, and co-creation and co-design. And even though of what I said about data, actually data can be another source of this.
So, I mean, I really agree with that. And in some ways, that's what I was trying to get at. So for me, I'm a qualitative sociologist. I work with ethnographic methods, which would always then involve kind of learning from the study participants themselves. And this is really what I'm trying to, I think that's the crux of it. I think that these things aren't distant futures. They're already happening on the ground. We know that from the data in places like Manchester. We know that things are changing. So in some ways, I'm saying we need to be able to identify where these emergent ways of life are kind of taking hold, and go and learn from those people. And that then requires new ways for cities to look at their data and see emergence. At the moment, data is very car oriented. So we can see car declining in some places. We know what's happening to car. Seeing what's emerging, seeing the new. We don't particularly have the data for that because the way that we collect and analyse data hasn't been done in that way. So I think in the first instance, we need to be able to see where the emergence is. And then as sociologists, we can go and find out from those people how they're living and how they're achieving everyday life.
So we should apply for the job to lead the Skunk Works for number 10.
Sure, yeah. I actually had some questions for you, Monica, as well.
Yeah.
It's really interesting. And so one of my questions to start with, which will perhaps just help you to expand a little bit more on what you're getting at with the societal readiness, but you gave the example of electric vehicles, and you classified them as and the kind of the positioning of charging points and that kind of thing, and you sort of said quite decisively that they were low down on the societal readiness scale. But you might argue that in some ways electric vehicles are being introduced and embedded into society in ways that replicate the fossil fueled car. So in some ways society is actually extremely set up for kind of harnessing that technology. I mean, you might argue that society is really ready for electric vehicles. So I wondered how you would respond to that kind of challenge.
Yeah, it's really, you're poking your finger in a can of worms, really, because the whole idea of societal readiness levels, people completely misunderstand it when you talk about it very often, because what they associate with it is the social acceptance. So it's within the same model that we're in with the technology readiness level. So you could argue, and so you could say, no, at the technology readiness level, electric cars are at 9. They are the highest because they are already embedded in society. People are buying them, they're using them for their everyday journeys. They can charge them at home. They have all these charge points all over at motorway services and everything. So the problem is really social acceptance. People are not buying them enough. And to increase the social acceptance, we can then look at, we need to put more charge points in. But what I'm getting at, and that's where we have to take a more systemic perspective, and we have to take a more value-led perspective, and also a more science-led perspective, because tinkering at the edges like this, facilitating a switch from a fossil-fueled mobility system to a electricity-fueled mobility system that still consumes energy and makes carbon, it doesn't solve our problem. So it doesn't solve our need to decarbonize, the scale of the challenge. And it also doesn't change the mobility system. It's a bit the same question as I asked you, it doesn't make systemic change. We need to rethink where we work, where we live, how we organize our lives, how we shop, to really bring about the scale of transformation that we need. So for me, the societal readiness is not about supporting social acceptance or how best to change people's behavior. It's about thinking with everybody involved, what's good for society, what's good for people individually and collectively, and how can we make that happen, and how can we make it, in the terms that you talked about, practicable at day, in the rain, in the dark. So
yeah, thank you. So I suppose related to that, I wondered, because you did mention place a little bit in your talk, but I wondered if you could say a little bit more about how place would be brought into that kind of approach that you're arguing for then, and what differences might we expect to see in different places?
Yeah, so maybe you can help me with that a little bit as well. But there are many different ways. So if you look at the UK, there are many different types of places. So there's the Lake District with a very small resident population, but an absolute explosion of tourists normally in the summer season. There are, I don't know, I think 40 times the number of people who go there. Millions, thousands live there and millions go there. And then you have places like Manchester that you talk about, or Lancaster, York, heritage centres, and they have very different carbon footprints and very different opportunities to decarbonise. If you've got Manchester, you've got public transport could play a massive role, whereas in the Lake District that's much more difficult because people arrive with their cars. So they each need different approaches to decarbonising. If you make it more place-based, you also can get people much more involved in it, so give much more empowerment and ownership of the solutions. So that those would be two things, and I know you have ideas, so I could just turn the question around.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I do think it's interesting because obviously different places have different people of different proportions of people in different age groups and different social class. There's different kind of cultures of mobility, different infrastructures already in place. People are equipped differently. So I do think there's a really strong argument for a place-based approach in that sense of the term. In that we need to be starting out with the starting points of the different places, rather than bringing in kind of one-fix-all solutions that in fact then create lots of unanticipated consequences. So yeah, it's really interesting to hear your thoughts on the place-based approach.
Yeah, I also think that we need to be careful of the concept because it's slightly cynical where it comes from, or not cynical necessarily, but driven by neoliberal capitalist ideologies that actually, if you have place-based innovation and different places produce different solutions, they can compete with each other and create a dynamic that way. And we also need to think about this issue around place. Politicians have a really, really strong interest in place, and there could be Machiavellian approaches to manipulating decisions around places that matter politically. And it's really important to be aware of the ambiguities and complexities of that.
Mm-hmm. And another question that I had is, I wondered, the societal readiness levels idea is really kind of aimed at the innovation community. Or that was my understanding of it, that you're trying to encourage innovation, the innovation community to think and perhaps approach innovation in a different way. And I wondered what the response has been, and if you had any examples of working with innovators with this approach.
Yeah. I mean, I mentioned misunderstanding earlier. People think that it's actually, oh yes, you're right. Absolutely, society must speed up and learn how to make use of our innovations. But that starts a good conversation where we can argue against it with the societal readiness levels. I've also had really strong responses from people like the Connected Places Catapult, who absolutely get the idea and really need to say that it's really important to understand how society needs to be brought in with it. But actually, I also aim this idea, and we've talked about this before, at society itself. I'm not saying that society is actually totally ready for it. People might demand change and political action, but to be really responsible carbon and data subjects requires a lot of skill and learning and taking responsibility. So it is a two-way street, and I think we need to develop that side of it.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Alison. Okay.
I was going to say, this is really interesting, but I have been reading all of the questions and comments people have been sharing and thinking it would be really fantastic to get some of that into the mix here. So maybe if we start at the end, because there are a few questions that maybe just flowing on from what you've been saying, Monica, might draw out a few aspects a little bit more. Ola asked a question about scale and how readiness might be understood at different scales in terms of locally, nationally, globally, where society is, or whether, how that might relate. And I think in some ways that links to the question that Carol has asked about, is this the only kind of readiness scale or type of scale that we should be thinking about? Because he mentions, societal unreadiness potentially as something that should also be considered as a way of, recognizing pollution, noise, road deaths, other types of things. And, I think that links to perhaps the question of misunderstanding what a society readiness level might be. But also I think relates a little bit to a question that was considering sort of globally in different areas. So, what this looks like thinking about the global south, for example. And you've said a little bit in terms of place-based, how that might recognize different demographics. But, I think especially the equity issues that you're talking about, Monica, to my mind, that is absolutely something that it's important to think about place in relation to these issues of scale, in relation to this issue of global inequalities, and what embedding a sense of equity into something like a society readiness level would really look like. So I don't know if you could respond maybe to some of those issues that a few of those questions have brought up.
Absolutely brilliant questions. In terms of the here and now, I think Carol's question about unreadiness, it would be wonderful to actually look at our current mobility solutions, the car. How societally ready is that? And I would put that at one as well, precisely because of the issues that Carol mentions about pollution, death, noise, and unsustainability, of course. And in terms of the scales of it, I think that's a real challenge. And that comes back to what Nicola was talking about, how we're working in the dark. Mobility is a complex system. And it's a complex system within a family, a nation, and globally. So we've got a project on gridding equitable urban futures in Cali in Colombia and in Havana in Cuba. And we're working with communities there who live in informal settlements, and they live either on the bay or in the hills, where electric bus doesn't work. And so what they have is 4x4s, diesel gualas, they call them, and they use them. And so what we really need to do is think about how Susan Sontag puts it, how our privileges are located on the same map as their suffering or their deprivation. And so, but we're working really in the dark of how to even make that possible to understand it. So through working in that project, I've come in contact with lots of stories, and stories are really helpful about understanding what lack of accessibility to mobility means for people in informal settlements. But there's a scale, how many stories can you listen to? There's a scale of attention. So I think data could be a measure, and one of the maps that I showed was a map that's proportionate to the population size in the UK, which distorted the geography of the country. And I love those maps that visualize relationality in new ways. And so I wonder whether we could drive research on visualizing the relational interdependencies of privilege and deprivation more.
I think those are really interesting points, and it also made me think of, in some ways, the amount of visioning and sort of imagined futures and kind of which places they belong to. So I mean, the urban mobility future has been really sort of invested in and developed. There's these very powerful ideas of what that should look like, and it's starting to kind of happen. We can see it unfolding, and in contrast to that, kind of places that aren't the urban, there's the imagination around that future and what it could be and what it might look like. It feels that actually seems to still be quite impoverished in comparison. Yeah,
that's really interesting. I'd love to follow up, but I feel like we should get to a few of the other questions as well, because there's so many good ones here. Nick, I might turn to you because there's a few that are following up different aspects of what you were saying. There's one that Klaus has shared, which I think would be useful to touch upon in some way, because you could probably later read all of the detail of it in terms of specifically thinking about issues around where we're engaging here. But I think the main theme is around, you were talking, by focusing on a kind of intermodal trip, more about an individual pathway and imagining what that might look like and sort of thinking out from there. Whereas Klaus is really raising the question in terms of sociology and how, should we not be looking at a different kind of set of issues in terms of thinking around political circumstances, forming the mobility system, and thinking about the broader context of, particular countries, for example, and how things are being approached. So I think that is partly to do with how you started from that specific trip. And maybe it would be worthwhile saying something more about how, with your influence of practice theory, you're thinking about broader dynamics and change. But that also relates, I think, to two of the other questions that were more around issues of what lifestyle looks like. In terms of multimodal lifestyles. Ola was asking about, how do we identify low carbon multimodal lifestyles? What might that be? And Lynn had a comment as well that was referring to the role that people like employers might have in terms of thinking about lifestyle change. Because things certainly, imagining what's going to be happening, this isn't something that only would have to happen because of COVID. Employers could just be encouraging working from home or 4-day weeks or these other kinds of measures we've long known about as potentially encouraging more systemic change. So I think that's an invitation really to think more about not only this question of sort of how the trips relate to things like lifestyles, but also how these different roles, whether it's like particular organizations and employers, or how we think about more systematic aspects of politics, link into understanding what's going on there.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, there's quite a lot there. I mean, so to take the first question that you spoke about, yeah, I mean, I thought the question about the kind of the politics of how mobility systems are made was really, really interesting. And I think in some ways, implicit in my talk is a city that, you know, Manchester, that actually do have a particular sort of approach, quite a very forward-looking approach to sort of designing the future mobility of the city, that is based on a lot of consultation with communities. They really emphasize vision and validate. They want to move away from the car, whilst also thinking about all of their boroughs. So in some ways, that's a place where I could find, I'm not saying there's not issues there, but there's a lot of resonance with, I guess, the kind of thinking and approach that I sort of want to support. And obviously then trying to do that in a different setting where those processes are done quite differently, that would present an entirely new challenge. So, and yeah, and obviously in the work that I'm doing as well, I am focused on a very particular issue, and exploring how a kind of thick sort of ethnographic study could open out a range of, I guess, emergence and possibility within a place. So yeah, I entirely sort of own the fact that I'm bounding that work in a particular way. Monica, yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna riff off Klaus's question to add to that, really. He asks whether we're not way too narrow. You're talking about individual mobility changes, and then he mentions, you know, societal developments like people recruiting people, you know, the UK recruiting people from Europe to work in our care systems, for example.
Yeah.
And I think that's where the beauty of the mobilities paradigm comes in for me, because it really has this multi-scalar fluency of connecting, allowing me to connect analytically the everyday individual choices that people make and the context in which they make these choices with the global flows of labor and capital and the broader societal. For me, they are all mobilities or blocked mobilities, and they are all connected, and it allows you to see the connections and the frictions and the contradictions. And so in the a recent symposium on unruly landscapes, we explored some of that around COVID, and we came up with these binaries that are really continua, where, you know, we're talking, there are all these stories about precarity, responsibility, the future, freedoms, technology on one side, and on the other side we've got shared vulnerability, responsibility or responsibility, the present where we're making the future, the commons where those freedoms need to be negotiated, and the practices that the technologies need to support. And actually, I think it becomes possible as sociologists to look at the alternatives that people are already constructing, which relates to another question that somebody asks. And we need to be much stronger at telling these stories about alternatives and about bringing the data together that shows how significant they are.
I think one thing I've learned today is that webinars like this are always going to be unsatisfactory, because there are so many more interesting questions than we can possibly get to. And I just wish we could all be in a room together so we could go off and have our little side conversations about the bits that we're really intrigued by, because I would love to follow up many of the questions myself as well, because there's lots of interesting issues there. But unfortunately, we've come to the end of our time. So I think I will say that we should draw to a close here.
Thank you very much, everybody, for the interesting comments and questions.
Yeah, I can only echo that. And actually, I've had you here with me all the time. Thank you very much. And it's been really wonderful, inspiring, lovely.
Thank you so much, and have a good day.